for the discussion. And I'm pretty sure everyone has a lot of questions. We've seen so many projects today that really span a variety of approaches to AI, creativity, working with machines, being inspired by machines. So it's really fascinating what we've seen today. And I'm sure that everyone has questions. So please also ask each other questions. I will be addressing questions from the audience later on. But yeah, I also want to invite Neil to join because Neil would like to ask a question. So I want to give the stage to Neil.
Okay, I want to do that Matthias and Daniel kick off first, but let me just kind of throw mine out there. You know, I just want to say that kind of from a theoretical point of view, I think the importance of theory, and what is theory? But I think theory is about asking questions, and I really think we need to kind of interrogate very precisely the kind of questions about creativity that we've received. I'm much as I respect Margaret Bowden, I think that her approach is probably much outdated. I think we need to kind of start challenging many of those things. I think also, particularly the emphasis on the product rather than the process, I find a little bit disturbing. As someone who likes to think of himself as creative, I see it more based on a creative urge than trying to analyze the kind of the production or indeed the strategies used for the production. So, you know, I think I forget the name of the first person who was speaking, but it was outlining a series of different strategies that he put together. I think experience, playfulness, and analogy construction. I don't know the basis of those things. I don't know the basis of Margaret Bowden's thinking actually on these things. I think really we're in a stage when we need to really absolutely challenge something. But there was something that I really found very intriguing. I'm always struck by the fact that Melanie Mitchell says that AI can't be creative because it doesn't have consciousness. I mean, I don't know that we're conscious of everything we're creating. And I really like the comment that Manos put out there by Roger Penrose. Perhaps consciousness is, after all, merely a spectator who experiences nothing but an action replay of the whole drama. I mean, I think we're at a stage now, and I want to thank everyone for the presentation today, of really collectively rethinking what is creativity, challenging all these assumptions in the past. I'm not sure that human beings are even aware when that kind of light bulb moment happens, when these things appear. Maybe afterwards we think, oh, that's cool, that's cool. But I think we're really in a stage where we've got to kind of challenge many of these received assumptions, because I think we're at a point where, based on what I'm seeing today, we can start to really rethink what creativity is. But I want to hand over to Daniel and Matthias, because I don't want to be these are the guys who've been invited today. So Matthias and Daniel, thank you for the presentations. Really, I was really struck by these things. Really struck by them. Fantastic.
Thank you, everyone. Yes, it was a very amazing set of presentations, and right now my network, my head is spinning like crazy, how to process the entire information, how to come up with a coherent, in a way, thought process, in a way. So I really congratulate everyone. It's really, I think, many of the presentations, they raise very interesting questions, and I think also what Neil was saying, I was also thinking about the same kind of idea when it comes to consciousness in creativity. And for me, it's is it important for consciousness to be creative, in a way? Because we are saying that networks, AI, they are not conscious, so that means they are not creative or something, which is very sketchy for myself. Yeah, it's a very sketchy, in a way, understanding, because if I'm thinking about consciousness, yes, is great as a human condition, but in the same time, it could be a very negative thing, yeah? Because if we are thinking about AI, we are talking about biases in AI, yeah? But most of the time when we are talking about biases in AI, we are referring to this kind of racial, in a way, biases or this kind of aspects. But a bias is also a human condition, yeah? Human condition, it's also a bias, for example, yeah? The way that you are encoding certain things, that's also a sort of bias, yeah? So for example, if I'm very conscious about the process, I'm going to encode that kind of consciousness into that network, or the way I'm training things and so on, yeah? So what that means is that, for example, let's imagine a creative process. So if you start to draw something, and let's go back to drawing, and I'm saying this based on a discussion that we had with Wolf Prix, which is a great architect, like a star architect, and design principles at Blau, and we had the discussion with him, a lecture on Tuesday, and he was mentioning this kind of idea of subconscious in the design process. Yeah. So he was explaining in a way, if you are very conscious in the design process, in the creative process, what would happen is that you're drawing something, let's say you're sketching something. And if you are very conscious about what you're sketching, suddenly you start to process and say, okay, I cannot do this because this is going to be too expensive. I cannot do it this way because it's going to be made out of concrete, let's say, or this kind of issue, structural issue is going to come up. So suddenly I cannot draw things in that way. Yeah. So consciousness in that instance then makes you be obedient. Yeah. Makes you in advance in a way, makes you act in a certain way. And in a very pre-described, let's say, way. Yeah, it doesn't allow you necessarily to go outside of your consciousness or outside of what you understand as being correct. Yeah, and this is a very similar thing that happens also in neural networks. Yeah, I think Manos was pointing to Manos Vermisso was pointing to this. Three type identified by Demis Hassabis: interpolation, extrapolation, invention. And if you are thinking about it, then if we are conscious about the design process or creative process, mostly we are interpolating. Mostly we are interpolating within our what we are conscious about. Yeah, but we cannot extrapolate outside of what we are aware of. Yeah, so. Is that then the consciousness? Is that something that is actually important for the creative process? Or is something that actually just holds you back and doesn't allow you in a way to go outside? Yeah. So I think this is something that probably I would also like to hear the thoughts of the presenters. Where do you see in a way this kind of idea, of consciousness in the creative process? Is it something that actually helps us, or is it something that makes us be extremely conservative without actually realizing it? Yeah. Conservative in the sense of, you're really like just working within what you're aware of. Yeah, you're not going outside and you're not challenging in a way your own understanding of things. And then also I would like to bring the topic in of, we are discussing about types of or creativity, and in some instances we are talking about, or some presentations talked about AI being used as a sort of almost like an inspiration, as a sort of muse. And in other cases, we are talking about the AI actually being creative. Yeah. So here, if we talk about creativity as a muse, or AI as a muse, or this kind of digital tools that we are using as a muse, then for me, that will be the question about like, are we encoding our own human condition into this kind of algorithms? We are too conscious about the process, and then we are just encoding that kind of like very conservative in a way understanding of things. And then the other side of, are the machines actually creative? For me, the big question that I'm questioning currently is that machine really creative if we are not addressing the aspect of overfitting? Right now, I know that we are, most of us, we are creative. We are not so maybe tech savvy, but that aspect of overfitting, it cannot go together with a claim of creativity. Yeah? We cannot really say that something is creative if it's just overfitting, if it's just memorizing a data set, for example. Yeah, because that's the classical, in a way, Chinese room problem, where just because you know to translate something based on a dictionary or based on a rule set doesn't mean that you're intelligent enough to actually speak Chinese. Yeah. So the same also here with networks, just because you're able to output some images that look creative, that doesn't make you in a way a creative network, just because you're memorizing everything and you learn based on rules in a way that. So I would like in a way to, maybe also Matthias will intervene now here, but would be great after that to hear some thoughts from the presenters. How do you see this kind of aspect of, is really consciousness that important for creative process? Or is it something that actually it's a strong bias that limits us to be creative outside of our own, in a way, understanding of things? And then the other aspects of creativity when it comes to machines. Yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks. Great comment, actually. And now, after Neil and Daniel has taken away like the most interesting points, I'm going to try to pick up the scraps and see if I can do something out of it. First of all, thanks a lot for the fantastic presentations. They were amazing, inspiring, thought-provoking. I think there's a lot to discuss here. I'm sure we don't have enough time to do like all the things that would merit actually discussion. Yeah. But maybe I would like to start with some thoughts about creativity and, how creativity, and also how to basically approach trying to create a theory about creativity and AI, or maybe even just AI and architecture in general. Because I think there is, I do agree entirely with Molly Claypool here that there is no current theory on AI and architecture, or AI and creativity in general. There are bits and pieces and floating ideas out there. And one of the main questions that come up is, I have the feeling after rereading Margaret Boden, I tend to agree with Neil that some of the thoughts here might be a bit outdated considering the frame of conversation we have today. Certain parts, however, are still true, but we still have to think about it. For example, when you interrogate the philosophical framework of creativity, you get immediately pointed towards imagination and originality. Yeah, so there is a very faint discussion about creativity in philosophy, but primarily those immediately go towards what is imagination and what is originality. And that's a question really about, can an AI be, can an AI have an imagination, and B, is it original? Yeah. And one thing that is very clear here is the question also if we can actually rationalize creativity at all, right? Is it more like an emotion? Is it really a conscious process? As Neil pointed out, it might also be an unconscious process. Is it a visceral reaction to a visual stimuli that some persons have and others don't? Yeah. So there's like a ton of things here that need to be considered. And I also think that it goes along with questions that almost become esoteric. Like it's for me, the question if an AI can be creative is like a question, can AI love? Can an AI hate? Can an AI sense fear? Yeah, these are all sort of more emotional states, which I think are very hard to encode as a mathematical element that you can synthesize. Yeah, so these are very, very human questions at the end of the day. Now, in order to understand maybe a little bit better, like how do we basically discuss aspects of imagination, I would like to point out to, for example, the writings of William Blake, who basically discussed that there is a dissociation of reason and imagination. So that already points us towards the problem of capturing these in form of a mathematical algorithm that allows us to synthesize it within an AI framework. Or Friedrich Schiller, yeah, who has had a similar thinking about especially the creative process, and discusses that, for example, in his letters on the aesthetics education of man. Yeah. And there's a variety of differentiations here about the idea of imagination and creativity in terms of, do you pick up on the knowledge of others, yeah, in order to build up your own imagination and creativity? Or, as, for example, Francis Bacon pointed out, everything has to be done from scratch, yeah, with experiments. So there's like these two ways of going about what actually creativity can be. I think it is, for me, as creative to pick up on historic examples of the architecture discipline and mangle them into a new project, or trying to imagine them entirely from your head, which at the end of the day is not even clear how original that would be, because my argument is that architects are really good in synthesizing knowledge that they already have acquired over time, and then produce out of that some sort of novel architectural solution. There's also questions of representation. For example, a lot of the AI work we saw also today relies on representation, imagery, 2D representation of space, right? You can go along with, for example, Wittgenstein, who actually, his thinking was that alle Erkenntnis ist Abbildung, so all knowledge is representation. So the building of knowledge based on representational devices. And if you think about the AI or the neural networks we're working with, they primarily work through that sort of problem, like really creating knowledge through representation. Yeah. There's many more points here, especially like about how to create a theory, like ideas. What do I do? Do I use a deductive method? Do I use an inductive method, etc.? So there's like a variety of questions here in terms of creating really a theory out of this. But there's one last point I wanted to go to. I was really happy that Michaela pointed out the problem of bias, because it was not mentioned in any other of the presentations, and I was pretty surprised about that. Yeah, that basically the idea, and this is really a criticism, that neural networks also have a tendency to have biases, like in the way how we as the coders encode them with specific databases. Yeah, and if you look into the work of AI in culture, or neural networks in culture in general, and culture for me includes painting, poetry, literature, architecture, etc., like everything you can imagine, because there is like in every one of those fields, there is already neural work happening at the moment, neural music, for example. The vast majority of those networks and results are extremely biased towards Western culture. Yeah, so they really the dominant feature within AI work currently is the Western hemisphere. And I think that needs to, the one potential that AI neural networks has is they can be extremely inclusive if the people behind it, creating those databases, allow it. Yeah, and I think we have to raise the awareness that that's an issue. It's nothing that we should gloss over. Yeah. And I mean, I'm happy about other discourses that are picking up on these notions, which might come into the AI and culture realm. Things like, for example, Ruha Benjamin's with her book Race After Technology and things like that, or ideas from the feminist technoscience that allow us to speculate about, you know, the meaning of artificial intelligence within our creative industries. And we shouldn't forget that there is something like creative industries, and that they will be part of this discussion we are having today in a larger scale in the time to come. And with that, I would like to end my entry here, because I think I would like to have discussion also with the presenters. Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to make a comment about this amazing body of work we saw today.
Thank you, Matthias. I actually wanted to invite to talk about the comment that he made earlier. Gabriele, if you wanted to respond to Neil, because there was a very interesting discussion already starting in the chat, and I kind of want to bring this into this discussion about pleasure. So maybe you can repeat for everyone the comment that you made in reply to Neil's comment earlier.
Yeah, sure. Neil was mentioning consciousness as something that differentiates us humans from machines. And that's the reason is said maybe for machines to not be able to engage in creative activities. And I was thinking that maybe the difference is biological, and the fact that the reason why we engage in creative activities is because we found pleasure in doing so. And pleasure is something triggered by some very low-level brain mechanisms. And I think there is some kind of genetic reasons for us to find pleasure in doing something. And that's something that we cannot encode in a machine, not yet, at least, unless we can replicate the brain somehow in a synthetic way. Yeah, that was my argument. And I mean, this thing was recognized by Nicolas Negroponte in the architecture machine, because the very first idea of the blueprint for the architecture machine was to endowing a computer with all kinds of sensors, right? So what Negroponte envisioned was a machine that could perceive the world through all different senses. And what we are doing now, we are channeling the information like just by using just visual information, and that's a very narrow view of the world. So machines cannot experience the world; they don't have any way of seeing things the way we see them, and this is another thing for machine to not be able to reason the way we do. Yeah, that's what I said.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting, because Carl Friston is also talking about that in his free energy principle, that there is still a very big difference between biological and artificial systems. And it's really interesting that he is basically pointing out that movement and attention is at the core of any organism, that it basically like moves through the world and finds attention and pleasure in certain things. So we're certainly not able yet to encode that in machines, but it's interesting to think that we might be able to. And I kind of wanted to bring that back and basically ask another question. So maybe, yes, sorry, Neil, go ahead.
I just wanted to thank you, Gabriele, for that comment. I think that's a really interesting comment. Pleasure. It makes me think of Laura Mulvey's essay on visual pleasure. I'm sure there's something down there, but maybe the term pleasure is difficult to. Maybe it could be another term like stimulation or interest. You know, and I think these ideas have never been interrogated very much. You know, I once had a discussion with Andrew Benjamin, who used to be the big philosopher at the AA a few years ago. And he said, that doesn't interest me. I said, what do you mean by interest? What do you mean? And he couldn't tell me. You know, and I think this is really a very, very provocative question. What is that, whether it's pleasure or interest or stimulation? I think you're onto the right issue. So thank you.
But here it's also, I think, just to interject a bit here, like if you say pleasure, you're mostly talking about you as a human, yeah? Like if I'm looking at the output that the network, let's say, generates, does it create pleasure or something? But that's a sort of evaluation then as a human, but you cannot evaluate the network from that kind of perspective. Is the network creative? It's not creative because I personally don't find pleasure there. It's like, you know, I don't see it as a sort of measure of creativity then, yeah? Because the same happens also with our work, yeah? Like we have a very small pool of peers that actually find our work fascinating, but the vast majority of the population of the globe, maybe they see our work as being, you know, what's that, just noise, yeah? So in that sense, I think we have to, when we judge in a way, or separate, like, are we talking about human creativity, like, or AI that helps us to be more creative or inspires creativity in us, or AI being creative, yeah? I think those are two separate things that we have to address them accordingly in a way.
Dennis, to add to that, I think my other problem about Mark is to say, who judges? You know, who judges his creativity? I mean, the fact that Van Gogh was not even recognized in his lifetime, and is creativity in the eye of the beholder or in the mind of the so-called creative agent? I agree with you.
Yeah, we should be able to differentiate between the product and the process, because the product is, of course, the creativity of a product is an extrinsic property that someone assigns to a product, right? So we are talking about the process and the driving force for someone to be creative in the first place. So we are talking about motivation. So we humans generate problems because we find pleasure to solve them. That's the reason. We make new discoveries because we generate new problems. Otherwise, there would not be any reason to progress in the sciences or any other human endeavor. We do that because we find pleasure in solving problems, in discovering new things. There must be a biological reason for that, but
yeah, I think it's important.
Manos,
Gabriele, I agree. I think it's important to kind of distinguish between pleasure as a kind of reward mechanism, as opposed to pleasure as a kind of almost evolutionary kind of factor. And I think this goes back to the Baldwin effect, and which essentially describes the fact that our genetic, let's say, change over time is partly encoded, when we're born, and partly depends on the interaction with environments. I think humans tend to kind of, going back to reinforcement learning and the whole the similar concept, right? We tend to repeat those kind of actions which would tend to increase a particular kind of physiological reactions which are happening, which in this case, referring to pleasure, give us pleasure, and avoid other ones which would give fear, pain, or stress, and so on. So I think this is kind of fundamental, but it also situates the discussion about the process of creativity as opposed to the result of creativity. And the creativity has been studied along different layers, but I think at least on within the context of my work, I think it's very important to understand the process before we get to the point of the result, because we can learn a lot from that. And I had one more comment in relation to Daniel's and Neil's earlier point about consciousness. With regards to our perception of that as a kind of more Gestalt framework, if we understand the value of the creative moment as a kind of continuous process which depends on several let's say modes of operation, which involve both conscious and unconscious thought. If we go back to Poincaré and the understanding that a lot of the conscious kind of organization of data or whatever preparation is taking place is only perhaps a small percentage of the internal procedure that goes on in our brain. You know, the unconscious process is much larger, and the aha moment that is not really an aha moment. It's basically a manifestation of the moment where the conscious and the unconscious converge. So we're actually able to manifest that as a possible solution. Penrose has an interesting set of interesting comments about, for example, animal consciousness, which aligns with the possibility of this in humans, and the moment when you find that a chimpanzee discovers how to actually reach for a bunch of bananas which are hanging from a particular in a particular context. And the interesting thing is that the realization has leaves no doubt about whether the solution to the problem that was being processed is correct. And the same thing happened with a lot of historical studies. In Poincaré himself talks about particular answers to mathematical problems which arrive after a long period of disengagement with the task at hand. And yet what he's really highlighting is that he's extremely sure about the correctness of the answer. There's no let's say questioning about whether this is a possible solution, but it's already kind of embedded that, or there's some kind of inherent recognition that this is the actual solution to a problem. And I think this is fundamental. So ultimately, we should not forget that, just kind of to conclude here, that the unconscious and the conscious can only be examined in relation to each other. If we don't have a conscious, we can't say we have an unconscious. And we could describe them as, of course, as semantic terms for us to reorganize our thoughts. But I think at the end of the day, even on a more physiological level, if we look at the cerebral and the cerebellar distinction, I think some of these ideas become more evident in the way that some tasks become embedded automatically and recreated as part of our brain, which, again, Penrose discusses further.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Martin, please.
Yes, I just wanted to make a point based on what Gabriel mentioned about why we are creative. As one possible explanation is because it gives us pleasure. I think we cannot compare human creativity to machine creativity on the basis of pleasure, because part of the biological basis of pleasure is encoded in our behavior to reproduce and mate. We don't encode reproduction and mating in machines. So let's talk, for instance, about birds. When they have to find a mate, to reproduce, they have quite elaborate and creative behaviors to attract a female. So we don't encode the pressure or the evolutionary mechanism in machine to find a partner, to mate, and to reproduce. So the machines don't have that. Perhaps if we encode that into them, more elaborate ways of creativity will emerge, right? Because the machine have to think in creative ways how it's going to attract a partner, how it's going to reproduce, how it's going to ensure that the the descendants they are going to survive. So a lot of what we do in society has to do with the behavior of reproduction and caring for our children. So when you talk about pleasure, you have to take into account that pleasure evolved as a mechanism to ensure that that we want to reproduce and pass on our machines to the next generations. And machines don't have that.
Could I just chip in something? This is a great discussion. I mean, I personally believe that we need to just kind of isolate and say we're talking about human intelligence, human creativity within a bigger spectrum. I think let's not assume that we have we're in charge of everything. And I personally believe in the notion of a second Copernican revolution of not putting us at the center of things. At the same time, what I would say is that kind of it'll be invisible to us. In a way, Alan Turing makes a comment about whether machines can create poetry and things, and he said, yeah, sure they can, but maybe only other machines will be able to understand it. So in some senses, a kind of creative, and this goes back to the kind of famous move 37 that we didn't understand in that game of Go AlphaGo versus Lisa Dole. It was kind of beyond our comprehension. So in some senses only, it's kind of like we're limited by our concept of human creativity, because otherwise we won't grasp that creativity coming out of machines.
Hi, is it okay if I jump in?
Yes, please. I was gonna say, like, Eli and you had comments. I saw your faces, so please go.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we're both from the current team. So I guess for me, maybe the more urgent question is when we define AI as an entity, creative or not, what utility does it actually have? Like, what are the values it will actually bring to our social, economic, or planetary challenge by us sitting here talking about whether AI is creative or not? I mean, I'm so happy that Victoria brought up Carl Fison, who is basically just working at next door in UCL. His free energy principle is so important, not only because it sort of advances on AI advancement, but because his formulation of active inference, the notion of any organized, self-organized system would be able to use an internal generative model to minimize variation of free energy on incoming sensory data basically means that any living entity has the ultimate goal to minimize internal or local entropy within the system. So this basically ties information to energy, meaning if we're able to use an internal generative model of some mechanical or social system, we will be able to understand energy transformation through information. So in that sense, if we're saying that creativity is also an act of minimizing entropy, we can actually tie social economic value in being creative for the machine, which perhaps accelerate the process. And I think that's also something that Current is asking very desperately.
Can I add? Sorry, just a second. Now me first, Daniel. No, just kidding. So I have a thanks a lot for that comment before. I think it's a really important and interesting comment, and actually ties into what I wanted to discuss, which is actually, I raised this point already at another, I think in the FIU PhD conversations we have on Sundays. At some point, I also raised the point whether there is a point actually to discuss whether an AI is creative or not. Yeah. It seems like there is, especially like in cultural theory, there is not that much conversation about creativity as such. I mentioned before that there is like discussions about originality, imagination. I've brought up myself points like authorship, agency, and things like that, which somehow are rotating around the topic of creativity. But creativity is an enormously elusive term to discuss. It's very, very vague. Yeah, it makes it very hard to pinpoint actually the discussion about it, even in humans, let alone in a machinic process that we're using. Yeah. So I'm wondering whether we're discussing actually something different here, which is rather that the users of neural networks are encoding their own creativity within a computational framework. It's not the framework itself is creative, yeah, but the way how you label a database, which kind of material you collect to get it done, which images you're selecting to put in the database, like all of that influences the final result that a neural network will produce. And I think the creative process might happen afterwards. When we interpret those results. This was mentioned today several times in the conversations. Martin Calvino very specifically talked about this, for example. I think somebody else mentioned the architect in the loop Yeah, Daniel also alluded to this a couple of times. So I think this is rather the conversation that I think is happening here, not so much whether explicitly the machine can be creative, yeah, but rather that what the result actually means within a creative framework that pertains to how we as humans interpret the resulting things. And I have to admit that I heard for the first time the term man in the loop when it came to the use in the military industry. So they basically, for example, automated drones that could do attacks. Yeah, there was a man in the loop because it was important to understand what's the ethical implications of what the AI is going to do in this case. And I'm pretty sure this is still the case today. I don't think there is like lethal strikes that are completely automated. There's still a man in the loop for the sort of ethical implications. And I think that's the role we are playing here in terms of creativity. We're like observing the results and understanding how can we use them within our own creative practice.
That's a great comment, Matthias. I think right now I will be able to attack what I wanted to say before on two levels, which is great. Yeah, just based on also your concept. So this kind of idea of utility of AI, like what's the utility of AI? So here, for example, you're saying that we are encoding perhaps our creativity in a way in this kind of networks, yeah? And that's why personally I was mentioning this kind of aspect of interpolation, extrapolation, innovation that Demis Hassabis is talking about. Because if I'm saying I'm encoding my creativity into an AI, I'm talking about that AI is going to create interpolations based on my conscious, in a way, understanding of a subject, yeah? Because that's how I am encoding things into that AI. And then also addressing the other aspect of utility of AI overall and creativity is like, okay, if I'm encoding a certain data, that's going to be what AI is going to output. So for me, it's like, why do I use an AI then? Just to iterate? Of course, I understand there are levels of creativity when it comes to interpolation, extrapolation, and innovation. But mostly what we are talking about, then we are talking about interpolations. We are saying we are going to use AI to help us solve certain problems that we have in the world, like climate change or stuff like that. But that AI is going to look only at the solutions that we input in a way, or our understanding of the problem and understanding of what the solution might be. So it's just going to create interpolation. So for me, that's why it's important then to think about, is that AI actually creative? Is it actually going to be able to go outside of what I'm encoding in, yeah? And I'm interested then in AI mostly at the extrapolation level than interpolation level, yeah? Is it going to be able to generate something new? Because then I see the utility of it, yeah? Otherwise, what I'm doing here, I'm just really encoding like past structures and expecting in a way that I'm just going to interpolate, I'm just going to average something out, and I might find an answer. So for me, it's like also when it comes to climate change, actually, are we so sure that we as humans, we know the answer to solve that problem? So that we are so confident that if we just input ourselves enough data into an AI, the AI is going to be able to give us the proper solution for solving the climate crisis? Or is it more like, can an AI actually shed light about a different kind of solution that we never thought of? Yeah, you know.
I actually have a comment following up to that, if it's okay. But I think the idea of extrapolation versus interpolation is really important. I think currently right now, and especially with all of the computer vision algorithms, specifically with GANs and regression networks that were discussed today, they're all static. You know, they're trained, there is this idea of training time where they learn features from this closed system, this data set, this conceptual space, and then they are deployed in the world. But it's right now, you know, none of the algorithms that we've discussed actually deal with time, which I think time is really important in actually successfully tackling this problem of extrapolation. And I think that's why it's really important to keep discussions of human intelligence or human processing and machine processing separate, because human processing is all built around time. You know, we all have spiking neural networks that are composed of spiking neurons that literally encode information temporally, whereas neurons within machine learning artificial neural networks do not encode time in the same way. And so I think that when we, you know, we almost need to kind of, in this discussion of creativity, say we can define creativity in simplistic terms for simplistic models like what we're working with right now, and then kind of set a framework for maybe controlling how algorithms are designed and use time and extrapolation in the future for what we want to actually see come out of these models. I actually, there hasn't been a significant amount of work with spiking neural networks, which are computational models that are more similar to how the human brain works. But I'm hoping that as computers and GPU chips become faster and better, that we'll see more explorations into how those models can be used for different computer vision tasks.
Oh, sorry, Victoria. We don't hear you, but I guess Manos or Michaela.
Oh, sorry. Just a quick interruption. I just wanted to clarify because we are a lot of people talking. So if you could raise your hands before you speak, so that everyone has the opportunity to speak equally. So please use the raise hand button before you speak. Sorry, Manos, please.
It's just a brief comment because I was noting earlier when Daniel was talking in relation to Matthias's comment about whether it is the actual process of AI that we're using as a kind of vessel to channel our own creative thinking, or if the AI itself can be creative. And I think Daniel, I agree, with Daniel 100% that the problem right now is that we can encode only our conscious understanding of data into a neural network. We haven't found yet a way to encode the unconscious part. And by that, maybe this sounds kind of funny the way it's worded, but what I mean by that is that the ability to extrapolate in humans relates and involves the kind of association that happens, that is really not intentional on many levels. So if we go back to, I think in my last diagram, I showed the Francois Cholet diagram, which I think everybody is familiar with, which is talking about how, unlike the classical programming structure of AI, of symbolic AI, which inputs rules and data to get answers, machine learning actually requires data and answers to give us rules. So if we take this a little bit further, I think the real way to reach this kind of extrapolation, which could somehow approximate what unconscious thinking or innovation from a human standpoint could be, would depend on a network suggesting the domains that it has to work within, and not just constraining itself to work within the domains that we set it. And by domain, I'm referring to the conceptual space of, let's say, really interpolating between one kind of architectural group and another kind of architectural group, but let's say interpolate between architecture and a completely different conceptual understanding, like in the case of Daniel's work on the Sagrada Familia, the forest and architecture. This was something that was encoded by the designer. But if the network could have suggested the domain, then I think this would be a step towards, making that kind of extrapolation start.
Thank you. Michaela, please, you had a comment.
Thanks I would like to address Alexandra's, the spiking neural networks question. There is an app being developed in Montreal. It's focused on sound and music, but they're doing like a lot of work with spiking neural networks and art and sound. So if you are interested in that, I can glad you put in touch with them, or just a comment on the spiking neural networks. Second thing is that I would like to maybe divert the conversation a little bit less theoretically and more pragmatically, because I saw also in the panel on its own, we went from like theory to practice, which I dramaturgically really enjoyed. And so my question, and also like regarding my practice, like I was one of the only, and possibly there was some others, maybe I missed it, but I was the only one, and probably the current as well, who was talking about or thinking about their audiences and their and thinking about the users. And what I know that some of the architectural apps were also, of course, it's B2B, so they were of course functional and are made for usage. But when we look at the audience and co-creation with the AI, how users can do it themselves without necessarily being able to code, like this is where I would like to kind of turn the conversation, because it's not only about like the researchers speaking to their own kind and just like, the conversation is then too close, right? We need to get this conversation out. And this is why I make stuff that might seem maybe for some people here pretty basic or let's say commercial, but at the same time, it's all about how can we increase digital literacy? How can we understand? How can people understand AI and not be afraid of it? And this is why, for instance, in my work, you saw the range from Chomsky to like musical environments or sound experiences, and through a pre-crime calculator, which is, which discloses the bias of predictive software in a simple way. And so it's kind of, going from co-creation to also, bias and the datafication of basically our digital selves. And I'm just surprised that like not many people have touched upon it. So like that would be, yeah, that's my question for the panel.
Thank you. Did anyone want to reply to that?
Yeah, that's something that we discuss a lot in Current for the last 2 years, is this embodied real-time experience of the users. And I think it ties into the conversation earlier about sensory inputs, also the point that Alexandra brought up about the relationship to time, in the sense that we have sensory-based inputs into the body, like the way that all biological organisms feel versus the machine sensory inputs that are used for training the AI. But if we can track the outputs back out of the body and see the biofeedback relationship in real time, then maybe some more interesting things can happen, especially if we're able to work with biofeedback interactions within artificial systems. I think that that's a really important potential that we have there, kind of like what Michaela is doing with allowing the breadth of a user to interact with the AI outputs. Perhaps when we start actually being able to integrate real-time data, whether it's biofeedback or big data from environments to train AI in real time, maybe that's when we're going to start seeing more engaging and creative outputs. The question is how and when, maybe.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting. I also wanted to bring in, because we haven't had time for any questions from the audience yet, but this is a related question from the audience. What do any of the panelists think the role of the AI is in the context of society? I see mine as a specific engine to give a perspective. Multiple engines can be called and mixed. This is a question from Austin Cabaret on YouTube. So if anyone wanted to respond to that. What is the role of AI in the context of society? I mean, it was kind of like, with the audience, you guys started talking about it. So maybe Michaela, did you want to reply to that question?
Someone else has their hand raised from
previously. Did anyone want to respond to that? Yeah, provide, sorry.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I think, sorry, my mind just blanked for one second. Yeah, I think AI wouldn't work as a standalone system. It has to be an open system that bridge with other types of technologies, including decentralization that we see from blockchain, including the architecture machine that someone also mentioned earlier, with other types of algorithmic from procedural to rule-based system. So it's important the question of how we actually bridge between these different technology systems so that they actually act as an architecture machine that is able to reproduce itself and prolong its sustainability and be able to evolve through time. So like through different eras, we would be needing different types of AI. But if they're not open systems, if proprietary efforts and open source efforts cannot integrate into combinatorial pipeline, then the algorithm would just die. Like for instance, Alexandra and Michaela was mentioning spike neural network. If convolution and deep learning, they're not evolving and breaching into other technology systems, then spike is gonna come up and it's gonna replace them. And then we're gonna have other supercomputers, and then we're gonna have like quantum computing with exponential faster way to like decode stuff and encrypt stuff. So I think it's a means of how to actually aggregate effort between different open source and even like enterprise grade engineering.
Thank you. And since we're really, reaching kind of a limited time here, it's very late in Australia now. I just wanted to give the opportunity to give last comments. It's been an amazing discussion. Thank you, everyone, to all the great contributions that you've made. Are there any last comments or questions that weren't answered? Now's the time.
Yeah. Neil has his hand up.
Yes.
I just wanted to, I think it's been a great discussion. I think we should transcribe this and do something with it because it's been really interesting. I think we're seeing things happening in almost like a brain at work. And that's what I want to kind of just throw in there. I think some of the comments, especially I enjoyed the comments by Gabriele's comments about the kind of pleasure and all these things. But so feedback is absolutely kind of crucial to all this. But there's also a feedback out of the context. And I think one of the real advantages of having a platform like this, where you can bring people together from Melbourne and God knows where, is that you actually get this possibility of a real-time feedback going on. And when it comes down to it, I kind of get the sense that maybe whatever creativity is, and it is a really difficult problem, right? It might have something to do with that kind of interaction. I mean, that goes on in any sort of interaction itself. So it's kind of like an emergent phenomenon. I know that we discussed this in Manos, but I just think that we are seeing now, today, creativity actually happening.
I just, before we end today, I wanted to get final thoughts from Daniel and Matthias, our distinguished moderators.
Matthias, you can go ahead.
I was waiting for you to talk. Okay. Yes, so all of you are leaving me behind with a lot of buzzing in my head, like in terms of, understanding, digesting, processing all that I've seen today and the conversation we had, which I agree with Neil was wonderful. And it would be great to have a transcript at some point, maybe. It is hard to summarize all that was seen today. I think there's so many different voices here. And I think this is one of the wonderful things about the development we're currently seeing in this area is that it's definitely not a form of style. It's really more like a paradigmatic shift in cultural production at all, in general. Yeah. You might have heard the term neural music and neural art. Yeah, like neural art are people like Mario Klingemann, Sofia Crespo, and many others. Neural music with Dada Bots and Holly Herndon. Who else comes to mind? Yacht. Yeah. So it seems like there's a real cultural phenomenon happening. It's not necessarily a technological phenomenon in itself, right? Because that we are sitting here and discussing, is the system creative or are we as humans creative? It already shows that we're getting provoked by this new technology, and that provocation is a healthy thing to have in a conversation about a novel paradigm of cultural production at large. And I'm happy that we're seeing this also in architecture, and it's really changing ways of how we have traditionally been thinking about designing and the design paradigm in general. And I see that also, of course, in cultural production. And we saw that today in several examples. And I'm happy that this conversation was not exclusively about architecture, but it was a very inclusive conversation about a variety of different cultural areas. So all in all, this is basically, as I'm saying, you're leaving me behind with a wonderfully bossy, drunken head now to continue thinking about this. So thanks a lot for these provocations, guys.
Daniel?
Yes, thank you everyone for a very stimulating session. Like I also started my comments early on, like, you know, my network, it's kind of spinning right now. I'm trying to figure things out and so many great ideas here. I just wanted to just address briefly on a last comment that was made about the need to integrate AI with other technologies. And I think that's a very crucial thing. And probably that's why I personally have a sort of position that I have when it comes to AI and this kind of being critical in the aspect of AI is just interpolating and just outputting whatever data we put in. And just to point to a comment that Memo Acton made like a few sessions ago in a DDES program, he was pointing to the fact that we have to understand that the neural networks that we work with today, they are mostly based on surveillance technology, or they started probably to be developed that way. And that's why also, like Matthias was suggesting at one point, you know, you have the Western, in a way, civilization, let's say, that it's very well represented in this kind of models, and less other civilizations, because mostly it's always you deal with this kind of issue of if a civilization, let's say, has a way to document itself more or has the technology, then suddenly that civilization will be overrepresented in a way, yeah. And I think that's a sort of problem of how we are, what networks we are using and how those networks learn, yeah. Right now, they are just these kind of massive collectors of data. But yeah, as we also discussed in the previous discussions, like learning, it's quite different in humans than in machines, yeah. So I think this kind of, I just wanted to pick on that idea, and this kind of idea of we have to look at this technology not only in isolation, but also how it's going to integrate with other technologies, and also what other developments can be done here. And personally, I think if we can move away from networks that needs millions of data points, the better, because I think it's easier then also to remove this kind of issues of bias and so on, yeah. So once again, I think it was an amazing conversation. I wished, in a way, and this is maybe something that Digital Futures can think of, like I wish to have this kind of discussions go on for longer, because there are so many interesting people here, and we just managed to address, I think, a few of the presenters. So that would be something amazing if we can think of a way to open up, in a way, the discussion, to have the discussion way more longer than we have it now. But thank you, everyone. Once again, it was an amazing session.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Neil, you have the stage. You wanted to say something. Neil, you muted.
Yeah, just to say, in terms of continuing the discussion, alongside the Digital Future things, we've got a doctoral platform where we're discussing things. I don't know if I can see this properly now, but tomorrow we've got a session, same time, where we have Wolf Pritz and Tom Main, famous architectural practitioners, for those who don't know, talking about how they're implementing AI in the office. And especially, we're also involving Daniel Bolojan, who's going to be talking about this amazing deep Himmelblau project that is emerging. And this is something, what we're trying to do is establish a kind of a global classroom, as it were, where everyone from all over the world can kind of feed into this. And so the discussion does continue. So I just want to thank people today. This is, I mean, when we established this thing, we had no idea that it was going to lead to this, but I really think we're getting creative thinking coming out of it, and it was a fantastic session. We're going to look at how we're going to go and publish the transcripts and so on. And I want to thank especially the guy from XCool, who showed us that we could, in real time, for you having transcripts, and of course we should have these in Chinese as well. Why not? So thank you, and thank you, Victoria, and thank you, Gustavo, for all the energy put into it. Thank you also to the background team who are supporting us a lot below the surface, and thank you also to our special guest today. Amazing, absolutely amazing, fantastic. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, everyone, and take
Thank
care.
you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes,
Thank you for the invitation. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Stay
you.
connected.
Yes,
Bye.
stay connected.
Bye.
This is just the beginning. Hopefully there will be more connections. Thank you,
Maybe we'll
guys.
chat on Clubhouse.
Awesome.